Berserker Armour is one of the most unique creations in manga history. Typically, suits of armor are associated with protection. They're donned when people, usually knights, require that extra edge in battle, and more often than not, armor slows a person down. However, the Berserker Armour turns its user into the most dexterous and physically formidable human being possible, which is why it's more of a weapon than a defensive shell. And when you learn the true cost of wearing it, that analogy becomes even clearer. Because as awesome as the Berserker Armour is, it isn't without its weaknesses, and in this video, we're going to be going over 10 of them. We're excited to get into it, but before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we do have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. It's extremely difficult to control. The Berserker Armour is a weapon that turns a human being into the super-powered equivalent of a Viking Berserker. The Viking Berserkers were famed for going into battle bare-chested, wielding heavy weapons and fighting until the death, a rage-filled trance that seemed to negate the concept of pain for them. The Berserker Armour basically does the same thing, but it makes it a lot more difficult to control said rage. The Viking Berserkers used narcotics to enter their Berserker trance. Spiritual women called vulvas would use herbs like henbane to create a hallucinogenic gas which, when inhaled, put a Viking into the Berserker trance. Much of what they do while in this trance is, to put it mildly, horrifying. That's because it reduces all bodily inhibitions while magnifying all mental inhibitions. Fear, malice, and rage. These became fuel for the Berserker trance, and the Berserker Armour produces that same effect, minus the drugs. It latches onto a droplet of anger exuding from the body of its owner and takes them over completely, unless they develop some extreme mental fortitude. Guts found it shocking how easily the armor took control of his movements the first time he wore it, and every subsequent use has been a nightmare to go through. That's because Guts usually fights while drawing the absolute minimum amount of power he can from it, otherwise he will lose control. Guts' usual fighting style appears brutish, but is actually the result of years of training and skill development. He wields Dragon Slayer with such skill that he can decapitate half a dozen men and their horses with, but as the Berserker, he would break through his physical limits and plunge through those men and their horses, Dragon Slayer first. That would be awesome to behold if it didn't come with a trade-off, but of course it does. It requires immense mental discipline to make the armor work the way you want it to, and not the other way around, because when that happens, it can put your life in jeopardy. Using it breaks your bones and bleeds you dry. Like we mentioned in the previous entry, the use of the Berserker Armour is a lot like the Viking Berserker trance. Instead of using drugs like henbane to produce that rage, the armor uses ode, or the life energy imbued within it. When the life energies of the user and the armor align completely, it takes them over and breaks through every physical limitation that the human body has placed upon itself. Pain is an important sensation because it tells us when something is wrong with our body. When it's turned off, we can remove the limiters placed on our physiology and truly achieve superhuman strength and flexibility. But the problem is that doesn't mean the body isn't taking damage, the user just doesn't feel it. In Guts fights as the Berserker for the first time, he's able to leap across great distances and do somersaults through the air with Dragon Slayer. That's not humanly possible, and Miura-sensei showed us the consequences of such wild and explosive movement. When Guts leapt at Grunbeld and broke his shield, his leg muscles were activated unnaturally deeply. When Grunbeld smacked him in the chest with his corundum dragon tail, Guts was somehow able to stop it, but it broke an arm and a leg. The Berserker Armour put them back in place with steel spikes because its only purpose was to keep its user in fighting shape, but neither of those things are conducive for actual healing. When Guts takes massive damage, the armor does emergency repairs, but that's about it. It also opens dozens of wounds in his body and doesn't fix the broken bones beyond holding them in place. Guts has to be healed manually once the armor is removed, and that can take anywhere between hours to days depending on his injuries. So yes, the Berserker Armour allows you to stand up to godlike entities, but it also kills you in a way to give you the power to do that. If you don't bleed to death while trying to take down something much larger than you bargained for, then you might just during the recovery period, because it can take weeks to get off. Depending on the kind of injuries you sustain while fighting as the Berserker, the armor can take several minutes or several weeks to come off your body. This is extremely inconvenient, especially when you consider how unhinged it makes its user when active. Armor is already sort of an inconvenience. Though all medieval armor was constructed to allow as much mobility as possible, it still took a long time to put on and take off. Plus, it required strength to wear armor, and most soldiers actually just wore leather and steel brigandines. But if the user of the Berserker armor goes through a particularly grueling battle which forces the armor to burrow into their flesh to keep their body together, then the more damage they incur, the longer it takes to separate them from it. The first time Guts used the armor, it took several weeks to separate its teeth from his injured body, and several more weeks for him to recover to the point where he could move. That's because once the armor comes off, all the pain and the injuries hit the user at once, and without immediate medical intervention and an insane endurance level like Guts, it would be impossible for a person to survive the recovery. Also, if each full use of the armor incapacitates Guts for close to a month, then it isn't really a particular tool, is it? A month doesn't feel like a long time to us, but it is, and when you're chasing a goal like preventing the end of the world, every second counts. Apart from the fact that all the damage you take as the Berserker hits you after the several days it can take for you to get out of it, there's also the fact that each time you use it, it takes a piece of you, quite literally. Users lose their senses with prolonged usage. It would be one thing if the Berserker armor took a long time to recover from. It's an entirely different thing when you consider the fact that with every use of that thing, Guts is dying. This is because every time he becomes the Berserker, his senses diminish. The Berserker armor puts incredible stress upon the body of its user. When Guts fights using it the first time, he develops a patch of white hair that signifies rapid aging. Later, he realizes food doesn't taste the same anymore, his hands are shaking, he can't really smell, and his vision is getting blurry. The Skull Knight calls these signs that the more he fights as the Berserker, the more he'll lose himself, until nothing remains but the rage within his heart. We wish that were poetic language, but as you'll learn by the end of this video, it's not. If we take a bird's eye view of Berserk, Guts has realistically used the Berserker armor's full strength, or close to its full strength, about a half dozen times. He used it to fight Grunbeld, Daiba's Makara, Ganishka, and that one sea god whose whiskers turn into massive sea slug demons. Apart from these major engagements, he's only drawn the bare minimum power of the armor, just enough to dull the constant pain that he's in, and yet, by the time he reaches Elfhelm, he can't fight without bandaging Dragonslayer to his hands, his vision has gotten so bad that he's missing easy targets, and he looks malnourished, for lack of a better word. Guts is basically wasting away because of the Berserker armor, and that's because it's essentially overloading his nervous system. All our senses, thoughts, movements, muscles, bones, everything needs nerves to function. Without our nervous system, we'd be vegetables. And it looks like that's what prolonged usage of the Berserker armor turns you into. This also creates a paradox that further reinforces the use of the armor. The armor creates an addictive, self-destructive loop. So we've established how the Berserker armor is extremely difficult to control, how it basically kills its user slowly, and how it can stall the progress of a mission by several days depending on its user's injuries. Those are all pretty significant weaknesses for a magical fetish that's supposed to be one of the most powerful in the world. Perhaps one of the greatest is the vicious cycle of dependency it creates in its user. We see it when Guts, even after having nearly died because of it, elects to wear it for mundane tasks like walking just because it's more convenient. The Berserker armor is not a thing to wear for convenience. The advantage it gives to its users can also develop into crutches. For instance, when Guts goes to fight the Sea God, he remarks that the fully activated Berserker armor gives him some sort of night vision. He can see clearly within the cave of the Sea God, which has no light, and no elves are accompanying Guts on this mission. He also notes that with the Berserker armor, he hears things a lot better and can see a lot farther than usual. But when his normal senses start deteriorating, he says that he still can't do without the armor. This is a major red flag because it shows you that he's become dependent on it for the most basic of things. We've seen Guts training multiple times across the series. Even when he lost his arm and his eye, his reflexes were completely on point. He was never dependent on anything like he is now, because without the armor, he can't even lift Dragonslayer without strapping it to himself. It ends up creating a self-destructive loop that is no better than drug addiction. Guts knows that using the armor is killing him, yet because his senses are diminished without it, he can't stop using it. This is bound to create some rather major complications for him, not just physically, but also mentally, because this is happening relatively quickly into his acquisition of the armor. He hasn't even had it for a year, and things are already this bad. If he keeps using it for several years, how much worse will his dependency become? It is possible there will come a point where he won't even be able to walk without the armor, and that will be because of the armor. It doesn't help that Guts isn't the most mentally stable guy, because that plays directly into our next point. It distorts your perception immensely. The Berserker armor is an object created with one purpose in mind: killing. To that end, it optimizes everything towards killing. Physically, it ensures that its user can perform beyond peak human conditioning and keep fighting, even with broken bones and a puncture in their chest. But mentally, it removes all obstacles to killing, and that includes human perception. Perception is the biggest difference between a person who takes lives and one who doesn't. It's the perceived value of human life that makes it so precious, and Guts has killed plenty of people in his life. He has certain lines that he won't cross as well. Even during his lowest point in life as the Black Swordsman, he never killed children or allowed any harm to come to them, because to him, they were the only ants worth protecting. Friends are people he goes above and beyond in caring for. He fought 100 knights just to let Casca escape, and he took on every single apostle within the Eclipse to avenge his friends. But when he becomes the Berserker, he doesn't see friends or enemies. All he sees are vague outlines of enemies with gnashing teeth that he needs to kill. The Berserker Armour optimizes its user's mentality towards killing. The best way to keep killing is if you think everything is a target. When Guts becomes the Berserker and loses control, all he sees are rows of gaping cones coming to swallow him whole, so he instinctively tries to kill them first. This would work if he were still the lone Black Swordsman, but now that he has companions, their lives are at risk as well. This is because in his lost Berserker state, they appear just like his enemies to him, so he's liable to kill them unless he's brought under control. If his friends need to worry about themselves every time he goes berserk, then how exactly is the Berserker Armour helping them overall? Certainly, it can't be used in isolation, because then it's liable to take over Guts entirely. The first time he fought as the Berserker, it was his friends' powers that brought him back, which means that he can't really ditch them to cut loose anymore. Apart from putting their lives in constant peril, this also brings us to our next point. It can only be worn with a powerful magic user. Because of all these complications that arise when using the Berserker Armour, the safest way to put it on is to spirit merge with a magic user. On multiple occasions in the manga, Guts allows Shirke to get on his back just as he starts the Berserker transformation, because this allows her to merge with the armor's ode and protect it from consuming Guts' mind. Before her mistress bequeathed it to him, she applied a talisman to the armor to protect his ego from collapsing, and that is why Shirke was able to save Guts the first time around. She doesn't know this, but every subsequent time she's pulled him out of his Berserker state without merging with it has been with the assistance of the Moonlight Boy, which brings us to the point we're trying to make. The Berserker Armour simply cannot be used without a magic user, and there are various reasons as well as a precedent for this. We'll start with the reasons. Apart from the fact that it is only with magical healing that the injuries from using the Berserker Armour can be repaired, we also have to consider that only magic users can fight effectively alongside or against a Berserker. This was proven during the Daiba fight, where the Eastern Magician had Berserker Guts on the ropes until Shirke was able to use the chaos of the fight to sneak into the armor and take charge of the situation. It's also fact that the previous user of the armor had magic-using companions with him. Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen our Berserk videos before, and we highly recommend you check them out, the previous owner of the armor was Skull Knight, back when he used to be Supreme King Geiserik. We don't exactly know a lot about Geiserik's life, but we do know a few things. He came to Elfhelm at some point, Flora was his friend, Great Guru Gedfring is still his friend, and his lover was the Great Lady Priestess of the Cherry Blossoms, who now lives as the Flower Storm Monarch Danon, allegedly. Geiserik was surrounded by magic users, and it isn't too big of a stretch to assume that they had accompanied him during his conquest of the world. If that's true, then he must have had a magic user holding him back at all times, which would explain how he conquered the world despite being the Berserker. At one point, Skull Knight compares Guts and Shirke to Flora and himself, and this is after he sees the young witch pull him out of his Berserker rage. This makes us think that Flora did the same thing for him back in the day, and that presents problems of its own. Magic users were a dime a dozen back in Geiserik's day, but in the current timeline, they're rare and persecuted. If anyone besides Guts were to possess the armor, we have no idea what their access to magical users would look like. Hell, Guts himself is currently missing his magic user, which scares us, because that means the next time he becomes the Berserker, there's a chance he might lose himself for good. This kind of dependency makes the armor an extremely inflexible weapon, especially in today's world. Shirke's mission to locate Casca is just as important as the upcoming fight against Griffith's armies, if not more in some ways. We don't know what will happen to Guts if he uses the armor in her absence, but we do know what happened to Geiserik because of it eventually. If that's any indication, it's nothing good. Users go insane with prolonged usage. It's said in the fairy tale of the Skull King that after uniting the lands of all men into a single empire, he reigned over them with tyranny and oppression. Apparently, Geiserik constructed his massive capital city, Midland, using slave labor from across the empire, and once it was made, he turned it into a den of sin. It was because of his excesses that God finally decided to strike him down and sent his angels to destroy his city, which vanished overnight and lies slumbering under the Tower of Rebirth. Of course, we know that's because Geisric's capital became the first ever eclipse sacrifice, and there are hints in the manga that he used to be a great man once. But even Skull Knight admits that he was a foolish king, and that means that there is some truth to the fairy tales that are told about him. Guru Gedfring remembers him in a good light, recalling fondly the days his dad brought him for audiences with the king in the village councils. But Gedfring never went to the mainland with Geisric. Flora did, and we hear that she too violated some sort of taboo that got her expelled from Elfhelm. But the point we're trying to make here is that the only living person who could have told us the truth about Geisric's descent into madness is now dead, so we only have Skull Knight's words about the Berserker Armour and his previous life to go off of. And he warns Guts multiple times that every time he fights as the Berserker, he'll lose more than just his senses. Calling himself a foolish king is incredibly mature 1,000 years after the fact, but it tells us that in his life as Geisric, he did do things that were terrifying to behold. In chapter 138, we're told a story about a priest that Geisric apparently tortured so hard he turned into void. This is not the guy Gedfring remembers from the village councils, so it's clear that prolonged usage of the Berserker Armour had adverse effects on Geisric's psyche. And he might not have gone full Looney Tunes, but he definitely became an extremely brutal and depraved dictator. We imagine that has something to do with constantly wearing an armor that amplifies every negative thing about you and paints a grim picture of Guts' future. Geisric at least had the resources to delay his descent into madness for several years, presumably. Guts was unstable before he got the armor, and once he acquired it, his Beast of Darkness became real to him. He can no longer distinguish its existence from his mental dialogue, and that's a scary thing. If Guts is seeing the Beast for real, what else is happening to his perception of reality that we don't know about? He might not live long enough to become an evil tyrant, but he will live long enough to do something incredibly stupid because all the foreshadowing points towards it. And when that happens, you can bet your hide that the Berserker Armour will have influenced him in a major way. The creator of the armor can manipulate it very easily. For as lethal of a weapon as it is, it always amazes us just how easily the Berserker armor can be cowed in the presence of its creator. It's an exceedingly clever allegory to the idea of divine life because no matter how powerful a creation is, it will always bow down to its creator. The Berserker armor is a dwarven creation. It was made by the blacksmith Hanar, presumably for Geisric when he first came to Elfhelm. In chapter 361 of the manga, we actually meet Hanar. Skull Knight and Gedfring bring Guts to him so he can do some repairs on the armor and also show him the true meaning of mastering it. Hanar takes one look at him and can instantly tell that while Guts has used it extensively, he hasn't truly mastered it. He decides to give him a taste of how the thing can kill him if he isn't careful, and then he strikes the armor with his hammer. It instantly takes over Guts and gives him a death vision of how Skull Knight died using it. While stuck in this vision, Guts tries to attack Hanar, but the blacksmith summons chains that hold him in place, even in his Berserker mode. This is a feat that even Grunbeld wasn't able to perform, which tells you that if someone were to kidnap Hanar and force him to restrain Guts, it would be extremely bad for him. And as it just so happens, Miura introduced a concept that can facilitate that very thing earlier in the manga. When the human marrow hybrid, Yzma, learns how to access her marrow form, she's told that she needs to use her real name to transform. Apparently, all magical creatures have a real name that they keep hidden from the world, because if someone became aware of it, they could use it to bind that creature to their will. Hanar might be in the astral world right now, but if Griffith were to somehow bring him back and learn his real name to gain control of him, he could neutralize the Berserker armor's threat instantly. This brings us to the final weakness that this weapon presents to its user, which is, it transforms users into vengeful wraiths. It's been implied many times throughout the manga that the end result of dying while using the Berserker armor is being turned into a vengeful ghost like Skull Knight. Whenever Guts uses it, we see Skull Knight warning him not to overdo it if he wishes to continue existing as a human. When Zod sees Guts fighting as the Berserker for the first time, he remarks that Skull Knight wants him to take that path to hell, which means that he knows Skull Knight is Geisric. We're also told that Hanar made the Skull Knight's current armor, and he calls him a talking coffin when he visits him in chapter 361, all of which points towards one thing. We're told that the Berserker armor kills its users early on in its introduction, but turns out that isn't accurate. It kills their physical bodies by draining them of all their blood until there's nothing left. It transforms their astral bodies into vengeful ghosts that are fixated on achieving the last goal that they died wanting to achieve. Skull Knight says on multiple occasions that he's no longer human. He doesn't think or feel or even perceive believe things like humans. All he cares about is the mission is putting an end to the God Hand. Geisric's final moments in life were spent seeing his lover die in his arms because of the God Hand, so it makes sense that that's what he's stuck on, but it goes deeper than that. In chapter 363, we see Skull Knight visiting the grave marker of his lover on Elf Island. He's visited there by Danon, who is supposed to be the reincarnation of his lover. She asks him if he's just here to see the Lady Priestess's mausoleum, and Skull Knight says that he is a ruin of love and hate who only exists to avenge the world he lost by purging evil from it. The way Miura draws this is like a reunion of long-lost lovers, but they've been changed so much by the centuries that they're unrecognizable, and this is the fate that likely awaits Guts as well. If he dies while fighting as the Berserker, it's extremely likely his soul will live on within it. A ritual might be needed to extract it from within the Berserker and imbue it within another armor, like how Geisric's soul lives on in the Skull Knight's armor, but if this is his fate, then we can understand why he wanted to just die in the latest chapter of Berserk. Chapter 380 saw Guts at his lowest, where, for the first time in his life, he welcomed death instead of trying to fight it. We don't think he was motivated by this specific piece of knowledge, considering he's been going through it recently, but if he ends up becoming Skull Knight 2.0, then maybe death is just better. Guts has already spent a large portion of his recent life dedicated to revenge. If the cost of using the Berserker Armour to fight his enemies to the death is becoming a vengeful ghost, then maybe Guts does just need to look for an alternative. It's clear to us that using the Berserker is an extremely risky option for him now that his Beast of Darkness is loose. We saw in chapter 373 that it is snapped through the chains it accepted way back when Guts received the armor, and promised to give him eternal power in exchange for, well, everything. Guts was ready to give up everything to Rakshas. If he's still alive after that, what does it mean for when he uses the armor again? Because he will, there's no doubt about that. Humanity can't win the war against Griffith without the Berserker armor front and center during the action, but if it makes Guts kill his friends and turn into a vengeful ghost, then we think this armor would have been best left unused, and we really hope Shirke can find a way back to her body soon. The way things are shaping up, she and Guts will be needed on the front lines sooner rather than later. We can't have the latter going into battle with all the weaknesses of his armor turned up to 11. With that said, we hope you enjoyed this video because marvelous verdict! That's all we've got for you guys. Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more marvelous anime content. We'll see you guys in the next one, and until then, just keep on struggling, strugglers.